Hey, Chris Leon here. This is the second video in the level building in Blender tutorial sequence in which I'm going to show you how to build a quick interior mesh just to lay out a space as a starting point for a level that you can then play through in Unity. I'm using Lighthook, one of our Hobby Game Dev collaborative internet projects for that as sort of my use case. So I just opened up Blender. This is Blender 7.1. And I can right-click on objects to select them. Actually, I'm going to do something real quick. You can skip this step, but I don't want any mystery as to how things happen. So I'm going to show you exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to go turn on my add-on. There's an add-on called Screencast Keys. I'm going to open up this menu, scroll down, turn on Screencast Keys, and again, you can skip that part. But the reason I did that is so now you can see when I push buttons. Like you can see I hid this sidebar with N, where this plus brought it out. And this will make sure you don't miss any keys I'm pressing. So if I hide and show my toolbar with T, you'll see that I'm pressing the T key and so on. Likewise, it should show my mouse buttons, so I can right-click on objects to select them. You can now see that down here. Speaking of which, if you do not have a mouse with two buttons and a scroll wheel as a third button, you're really going to want that for working in 3D, especially in something like Blender as opposed to even like Unity. You can kind of scrape by. You're going to really benefit from having a proper two-button and scroll wheel mouse for working in 3D editing. Likewise, if you do not have a number pad on your keyboard, say you're on a laptop, it's going to be helpful for you to get yourself a cheap USB wired keyboard even, just something with a full number pad on it. Those keys are very helpful when working in Blender. There are ways in the options to try to work around that, to let you emulate the keys with other keystrokes. Blender can be complex enough as it is. There's already plenty to be learning and doing without having to watch tutorials and then trip over your keys to do weird key commands to simulate having a number pad or a right mouse button. So, make sure you have the right equipment for the job. If we were building a scene that we were going to do a proper render of, then we'd want a camera, we'd want a light. But as our first interaction, I'm going to right-click on those. I'm going to press X. It's going to prompt me, do I want to delete it? Yes. Or if you have a delete key, in case you forget X is the key, I can right-click to select this light, press delete, left-click to confirm it, and that deletes those objects. So now we have just a mesh, and we could replace this as just a plain cube. Now, as to how we can move the camera around, it's a helpful thing to know in any 3D environment. That's all we're going to talk about kind of for this first video, besides setting up just having only a cube to look at. The middle mouse button, hold that down and click and drag it, or hold the middle mouse button and move the mouse to orbit the camera around a point. Hold down the Shift key, which I will not show down here, but if you hold down Shift and use the middle mouse, then you can pan your view. If you hold down the Control key and use your middle mouse button and move your mouse, you will zoom in and out, or, as you probably assumed, middle mouse or the scroll wheel will also have a similar functionality to it. Now, one of the most helpful keys that I use frequently when I'm in Unity that I wanted an equivalent for in Blender is the focus key. Of course, in Unity, you can press F, just like in Maya. It'll zoom your camera right to the thing you have selected. Well, the way that works, the closest thing I know of in Blender is the number pad period. Of course, it's the delete key if you had numlock on or whatever. But when you have any object selected, you can press the period key and it'll move your camera there. And it gets in kind of close. It gets real in up to its face. You can zoom back out. And what's nice about that to me is since I'm often using the camera orbit, it's a really great way to control what your camera's orbiting around. If you want to see something from different angles, like a face or a vertex or an edge, this is a good way to do that. Have it selected, press the period key. Now to deselect things, you might be used to environments where you can just kind of click away. In Blender, you can't do that. You can't just click an empty space to deselect. Instead, oops, I left-clicked. We'll talk more about that 3D cursor in a second. Right-clicking won't do it, but the A button is select all. It also deselects any selection. So I can toggle selecting all and deselecting everything with the A button. If you ever have selections of vertices left over from editing you're doing and you want to get rid of everything, just press A, it'll drop it. Now, speaking of which, I keep saying vertices and edges, when right now all I can do is select the cube. That's because we're currently in object mode. There's a million things you can learn how to do in Blender. It's a very advanced, very complex environment with lots of features and functionality. We're going to focus on the bare minimum that you need. And one of the things you have to understand the difference between is object mode and edit mode. And you can change them in this menu down here. Edit mode will let you change faces and points, and it's for deforming a particular object, as opposed to object mode is for manipulating whole chunks of things. The rocking chair, the character in the corner, the bed frame, whatever it is, separate objects are for object mode. Edit mode lets you deform and shape objects into, the separate pieces. Now, that's such a common thing to switch between that there's a great keystroke for it, and that's Tab. Tab will take you in and out of object and edit mode. So if you're ever looking for something like, okay, I want to adjust individual points on the shape. Like here, I'm right-clicking on points to select them. but you can't seem to do that. You can't select the points, and you can't even see the selector for points, you probably need to switch from object to edit mode. So as I pointed out there, my mouse has to be over the viewport when I press tab. If it's over this other stuff, it thinks you're trying to jump fields, like you're typing in numbers or something. Mouse over the viewport and tab to switch in and out of edit mode and object mode. And like I said, so I have a vertex selected, press A and clear it. Works the same whether you're in object or edit mode. A will clear, or select all. There's this 3D cursor. When I left click, it moves this point around. This used to really frustrate me because I didn't have any mental model for what this meant, how this was used. And it's not like you have a metaphor or analogy for this in something like Unity or Maya or even 3D Studio. It's just kind of this weird concept. It's actually, it can be a very helpful thing because when I add a mesh, if I want to create a new cylinder, add mesh cylinder, it'll use that as the default origin point, that thing that I did, or wherever I clicked that point. I find it hard to control using that point. I admittedly don't even really use the origin that often, at least in the kind of work that we're kind of doing for this kind of just rapid scale of doing things. But that's what that cursor is all about. I'm going to press X to delete that object. But just so you know, that's what that cursor is about. And again, you can really kind of frankly ignore it. Just don't left click on stuff and you can kind of ignore it. Now, you'll notice too that whenever I click, it's camera relative. That can make things kind of tricky to tell even where I was putting it, or if I was moving an object. You know, oftentimes you want to move things in something besides in the axis of your camera. You want to do like a straight overhead kind of viewpoint. First of all, so I've moved it away from the origin. I can recenter it with Alt-G. I'll talk about more of that in a second. But what I want to say here is that on the number pad, buttons 1, 3, and 7 let you switch between front perspective, right perspective, and top perspective. Very, very helpful when you're editing. After which, you can use 2 and 8, like up and down, to pivot the camera around the origin point, or 4 and 6 to rotate the camera around that point. And again, 1, 3, 7 will go between them. Now you'll also notice that when I use those controls, I've lost perspective. And what I mean by that, or I guess in this case I have it, so 5 on the number pad will toggle between ortho or perspective. And you're probably familiar with this from camera settings in Unity or some other 3D package, but in case you're not, that just has to do with whether or not things shrink at a distance. So you'll see here how the far edge of the grid is the same size as the near edge of the grid. It's because I'm in ortho. And if I have perspective, then things shrink in the distance and up close they get bigger. And where that especially becomes important is if I'm using these other editing views. I'm going to press Z to turn on wireframe. You'll see that if perspective is on, the bottom and the top points are not overlapping because the perspective makes the further away edge smaller. If I use 5 to maintain orthographic projection, then they'll line up perfectly. And so that's often a more helpful way for editing, making sure things line up, independent of their distance, is to use 5 to control ortho or perspective. Just also good something to be aware of. I'm going to press Z to go back into solid view. Now, like I said, so I can drag an object by its arrows, or I can press G to move it more generally. G is like grab. I can press left click to sort of lock in that position I chose. Control Z will undo your last modification or move, just like most environments. Control Z is undo. As well as if I press G, I move it somewhere. Again, this is planar to the camera. I put it there. Or if I move it somewhere else and I'm not happy with where, like, I didn't even mean to actually start moving. I pressed G by accident. I meant to do something else. I can just press escape and it won't lock in the change. It'll basically undo because I've never confirmed the action that I was doing. Again, so in the same way that G is grab, which is especially helpful for overhead views, because then I can move it around like on the ground plane, up and down. So G is for grab, R is for rotate, again, camera relative, and S is for scale, to scale the whole object. Now in the same way that Alt-G undoes sort of movement transforms by centering it in the origin, Alt-S will bring a scale all back to 1s. If I've rotated it in a direction I didn't mean to, Alt-R will undo any rotations applied to my object and just center them all back out at 0. Now, when doing these, if I press this plus button up here, I can pull out this transform bar and I can see the changes that I've made when I rotate it and so on. Oftentimes, we don't want to move rotations relative to the camera, but relative to an axis. In that case, I can press X, Y, or Z after R to constrain my rotations to a single axis. And again, you can kind of see over here the effects that it's having. Likewise for G, when I press grab, I can use X, Y, and Z to constrain motion to a single axis before I click to confirm, or before I press escape to undo, or to cancel my current action. Now, something else to be aware of when doing that is that in Blender, X and Y are ground plane. They're the grid on the ground that you're seeing. Z is treated as up and down. You'll see down here, I have Z on the widget down there. It's not how you're used to seeing things in Unity where Y is up and X and Z are the ground plane, but you know, as long as you're consistent, it doesn't really matter. You can always rotate the model if you had to, but Z basically is up in Blender. You just kind of get used to it. Okay, so we can rotate, we can move it around with G, we can move our camera, we can shift around. Now let's go back into edit mode, because that's going to be something we're going to use a lot when we're trying to build a piece out of a starting mesh. Actually, I'm going to take one step back. Let's show you how to get a starting mesh. So if I deleted my only cube, just like I added that cylinder, we can add an ecosphere, a cube, and so on. Ecosphere is just like a kind of a soccer ball type thing. Now notice again it started where my 3D cursor was, where I last left clicked. Before I do anything else, before I move it, before I drag it anywhere, I can press period to move my camera to it though. You look down here where it says added ecosphere, I can then control the subdivisions and the properties of it. And of course this is helpful to get a starting shape you're happy with before we start using our other modeling techniques to transform it. I can use Alt-G to center it, but at that point I've lost my chance to modify its initial parameters. Again, just to show an example, I can add a mesh that's a cylinder. There's my cylinder. I can safely move the camera around, but if I do anything to transform the object's position, scale, or rotation, I'm going to lose the fact that right now I can control how many sides my cylinder has. It's not too late. I can adjust the radius. You can also click and drag left to right. And the depth, before I do any other modifications, and as soon as I start doing modifications to it, now this will show the last step if I wanted to do tweaks to my previous operation on it. But at that point, I'm kind of locked in on how many sides I have on my cylinder. So I'm going to delete that. And let's throw in a cube. So right now I have a totally blank empty scene. I deleted everything with the X button and left clicking to confirm. Got my cube. I'm going to use Alt-G to center it. I'm going to mouse over this viewport and numpad period to focal point my orbit around it. And now I've got this cube. I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode. The most important thing for the kind of work we're doing here in edit mode to look at is these 4 buttons right here. Those are for vertex control, edge control, face control, and whether or not you can limit selection to visible, which I'm going to explain in a moment. Okay, so with vertex control, I'm going to press A, mouse over here to deselect things. Now I can right click to select a single point, and I can left click and drag to move individual points on the object. I'm using Control Z to undo my changes, but just want to show you that, you know, I could make any transformation I want on a vertex point by point basis. Undo those 2 changes. I can use this edge tool to click and drag a whole edge of my shape, or the face tool, of course, to operate on an entire wall of my object. I'm doing that. Now what this thing has to do with, it's fairly important, but where it mostly comes up is if you're trying to select points with a box tool. So let's say I'm in vertex mode. Box tool, by the way, I'm going to press A to deselect everything. I'm here in vertex mode. I'm going to press B to box select, click and left drag, and now I've selected these points. But I wasn't quite sure, was I going to select this point from the background? So this is more obvious if I'm going to press Z to go into wireframe. If I use box select, let me deselect all with A, box select, see how it did select this point back here? Maybe I didn't want that because maybe I was trying to operate on just the top surface. But now when I move it, that bottom point got grabbed up too in my box selection. And so I'm going to press A to deselect all. When I press Z to go into wireframe, it all becomes visible, so it doesn't actually matter. In that case, I can always select things through my shape in wireframe mode. But in a solid view, it becomes important is I can use this so that I can select points behind it just like I was in wireframe. So unselect all, box select. Now I got the back point in it, as opposed to all. If I disable this, then I'll only grab the points that my camera can see, that I have a solid view on. This is going to be especially important when we start doing flipped normal, sort of inside-out modeling to build rooms. I'll show you all about that in the next video. I want to introduce now this idea that this blocks my selection to be things I can see, so that when this is on and I'm in face edit mode, if I right click, I will always select this face that's right in front of the camera, never the one behind it. If I turn this the other way, I can click on that control point in the center and select these faces on the opposite sides of the square or the cube too. Now, these switches between point, line, and face are so common. There's a good shortcut for that too. You hold Control and press Tab, and it pops up this menu for vertex, edge, and face. I can also at this point press numpad 1, 2, or 3 to shift between them. So Control Tab 3 on number pad is face, Control Tab 1 number pad is vertex, Control Tab 2 on number pad is edge. So that's let me select the edges, and again, this is the important thing to realize as to whether you can select the opposite edges and faces and points on purpose, or rather by accident. This will toggle whether you see through the thing that you're editing. Also, again, so these bars, you can use T to hide or show the toolbar. You can use N to hide or show this other menu over here on the right with lots of controls and specifics. Okay, and you know, there's so many different things that we could be doing with modifiers and other stuff, with a hierarchy and so on. We'll talk about those things as they come up. I just want to introduce you to some basic camera movements, middle mouse and shift, middle mouse and move it around. Period key on your number pad to focal point your selection on whatever, or focal point your viewport on whatever selected. But anyway, so it should be enough for you to find your way around this. We're pretty well set up to start building a real basic fast level in our next video. So part 3 coming up soon. Thanks.